This is Criminal Interrupted, and today we're exploring one of the most disturbing cases in American history, the story of Richard Trenton Chase, a man whose untreated delusions and escalating violence left Sacramento in terror during the late 1970s. Before we begin, a very important note. This episode contains descriptions of extreme violence, including murder, sexual assault, and crimes involving children and animals. These details are deeply disturbing. The facts themselves are pretty difficult to hear. Please take care of yourself while listening, and step away if you need to. The victims deserve to be remembered, but your well-being matters too. Richard Chase would later be called the Vampire of Sacramento, a name born from the horror of his crimes. But behind that label is a story of systematic failure, of a man whose mental illness went untreated, and of lives lost because warning signs were ignored. To understand how this unfolded, we need to start at the beginning. Richard Trenton Chase was born on May 23, 1950, in Santa Clara County, California. He was the first of two children born to Richard Chase Sr. and Beatrice Chase, and he grew up alongside his younger sister, Pamela. On the surface, his early years appeared unremarkable. He was a healthy baby, raised in a middle-class household, and even celebrated a birthday party in childhood that grew more than 60 children, suggesting he was not socially isolated in his earliest years. Yet beneath this veneer of normalcy, his home life was marked by instability, conflict, and troubling behavioural patterns that foreshadowed the darkness to come. Accounts of Chase's childhood describe a household fraught with tension. His parents frequently argued, sometimes explosively. One incident during a family camping trip in Oregon illustrates the volatility. Beatrice accused her husband of having an affair with a woman she believed was hiding in the bushes, an accusation that derailed the trip and left a lasting impression. Beatrice herself displayed signs of paranoia and instability. She reportedly told others that her husband had drugged her in order to assault her while she slept. These claims, whether grounded in reality or not, suggest a household where suspicion and hostility were constant undercurrents. Richard Sr. is said to have been a strict disciplinarian who physically punished his son. While some accounts frame this as not unusual for the era, the combination of harsh discipline, parental conflict, and maternal instability created an environment of emotional insecurity. By his early years, Chase began to exhibit behaviours that psychologists later associated with the McDonald Triad, a controversial but often cited framework linking childhood behaviours to later violent tendencies. The triad includes persistent bedwetting beyond the typical age, fire setting or fascination with fire, and cruelty to animals. Chase reportedly displayed all three. While the triad is not a definitive predictor of future violence, in his case, it aligned with a broader pattern of psychological disturbance. Despite these troubling behaviours, Chase's difficulties did not immediately affect his school life. Teachers and peers did not initially view him as an outcast. In fact, his large birthday party attendance suggests he was socially accepted in his early years. As Chase entered adolescence, though, his problems deepened. He became a heavy user of marijuana and LSD, substances that likely exuberated his already fragile mental state. Chase began dating a girlfriend in high school in 1965. In subsequent interviews, this woman used the pseudonym Libby Christopher. The couple were unable to have sex the first time they attempted to do so due to his impotence. The relationship continued nonetheless, although his continual failure to achieve an erection led to their eventual split in 1966. This inability to perform sexually became a source of humiliation and frustration. At age 18, he sought psychiatric help, hoping to understand the cause. A specialist suggested that his impotence might stem from repressed anger, but no deeper psychiatric intervention was pursued. This failure to diagnose or treat underlying mental illness was an early missed opportunity. Chase's impotence also shaped his developing psychology. He later concluded that he could only achieve sexual gratification through violent or perverse means, including necrophilia and cannibalism. These associations between sexuality and violence would become central to his crimes. Even before his full psychosis emerged, Chase displayed unusual thought patterns. As a teenager, he became obsessed with the James Younger Gang, a group of 19th century outlaws. He pasted his own face onto photographs of the gang and tried to sell the altered images, insisting he was part of their legacy. He also engaged in bizarre rituals at home. Sometimes he would strip naked, turn the heater on full blast, and open the windows while sleeping in the family's living room. These behaviors hinted at a growing detachment from reality. By his late teens and early 20s, Chase's delusions intensified. He became a severe hypochondriac, which is a condition in which a person is excessively and unduly worried about having a serious illness. Chase became convinced that his body was deteriorating in grotesque ways. He believed that his heart would stop beating at times, someone had stolen his pulmonary artery, his stomach was upside down, his blood was turning to powder, and his bones were shifting and emerging from his skull. To treat these imagined conditions, he engaged in disturbing self-remedies. He placed oranges on his head, believing vitamin C would diffuse into his brain, and he shaved his head to watch his skull move. These delusions marked the onset of full-blown psychosis, likely tied to schizophrenia, though he was never properly treated at this stage. Chase first worked in a typing and phone answering job for Retailers Credit Association in 1969, while enrolled in the American River College. In the next few years, Chase continued to find other odd jobs in Sacramento, but he was still using heavy amounts of drugs and none of them lasted long. In early 1971, shortly before dropping out of the American River College, Richard Chase began sharing an apartment with two women, Sid Evans DiMarchi and Rachel Staton. The arrangement came about almost by chance. They found him sitting on their front lawn one February afternoon, struck up a conversation, and eventually agreed to let him move in. His parents contributed $50 a month to help cover his share of the rent. It didn't take long for his behavior to drive them away. Chase was frequently high on drugs, often walked around the apartment naked, even in front of visitors, and developed a habit of barricading himself in his room. When asked why, he explained that it was to prevent anyone from sneaking up on him. Both DiMarchi and Staton eventually moved out. Chase then lived with Staton's brother and his friends, who played in a rock band. He often interrupted their rehearsals, insisting on joining in with the conga drums despite lacking rhythm. Arguments followed, but he forced himself into their sessions anyways. Eventually, they too left, leaving Chase unable to afford the rent on his own. By June 1972, his parents had divorced, and his relationship with his mother grew increasingly volatile. He accused her of trying to poison him, an echo of her own earlier accusations against his father when Chase was a child. That same year, during a trip to Utah, he was arrested for driving under the influence. He later told his parents that he had been gassed in jail and wanted to sue the police. His father bailed him out and persuaded him not to pursue legal action. Over the next year, Chase drifted between his mother's home and his father's new residence. Both struggled to cope with his erratic behavior. When his father finally forced him out, neighbors reported seeing Chase standing motionless outside his property, staring at it for long stretches of time. His father dismissed these behaviors as laziness and poor values rather than signs of mental illness. In late 1972, an argument with his mother escalated when she tried to call the police. Chase grabbed the phone and struck her on the head with it before fleeing the house. Though officers told her she could press charges, she chose not to. Following this, Chase spent 2 separate periods living with his paternal grandparents in Los Angeles. She quickly noticed his odd behavior. During his first day, he worked briefly as a bus driver for mentally disabled children under the supervision of his uncle. He was fired for neglecting basic maintenance. He never cleaned the bus and repeatedly let it run low on oil, despite being told to take it to a service station. After losing the job, he spent most of his days in bed and wandered the house at night. He became convinced that someone was trying to break in through the windows. His grandmother overheard him talking to himself and once found him standing on his head in the corner of his room. When she asked why, he explained that he was trying to get the blood to flow back into his brain. He also complained of chest pains and leg aches. During his second stay in Los Angeles, he briefly worked at a paint store but was fired within days. His grandmother later remarked that both his mental state and physical appearance had deteriorated significantly during this time. By the summer of 1973, Chase returned permanently to Sacramento. His behavior grew stranger still. He began cutting out pictures of human organs from medical textbooks and pasting them across his bedroom walls, convinced that studying them would help him understand what was wrong with his own body. Around this time, he even called for an ambulance, requesting a stretcher. When paramedics arrived, they refused to transport him. He wasn't experiencing any medical emergency. Desperate, Chase went to his mother, begging for help. She arranged for him to see 2 different doctors, but he rejected their conclusions. Finally, he consulted Dr. Donald Ansel, who found nothing physically wrong with him but diagnosed a psychiatric disturbance of major proportion. That same year, Chase killed one of his own cats after watching a television program about a pet that had received advanced medical treatment. The story enraged him. He believed he deserved that kind of care, not the animal, so he killed his own cat. In December 1973, Richard Chase walked into the emergency room at American River Hospital, panicked and disorientated. He told doctors he couldn't breathe, that the blood had stopped flowing through his body, and that he was in cardiac arrest. He even claimed that he had lost his pulmonary vein. Dr. Irwin Lines, who examined him, described Chase as tense, nervous, and wild-eyed. In his report, he wrote that Chase was filthy, disheveled, deteriorated, and foul-smelling. The hospital diagnosed him with acute paranoid schizophrenia, though they also noted the possibility of drug-induced psychosis. Chase was admitted to a psychiatric ward, but he only stayed 2 days. His mother confronted the staff, demanding his release. Dr. Lines later described her as highly aggressive, hostile, and provocative, even referring to her as a, quote, so-called schizophrenic mother. After discharge, Chase's condition seemed to improve for a time. He took medication, gained weight, and was even given an oxygen tank to help with panic attacks. But the stability didn't last. His mother claimed his decline began again when he returned to illegal drugs. His father disagreed, insisting the problem wasn't drugs at all. As his mental state worsened, his mother overheard him talking to himself. He struggled to sign his own name. He accused her of controlling his mind and later turned the same accusation on his sister Pamela. Once, during an argument, he slapped his mother across the face. Other times, when she tried to calm him down by putting his father on the phone, Chase flew into violent rages, damaging the house. Eventually, neither parent could cope, so they set him up with his own apartment. At first, Chase kept the place relatively clean. His father even visited for games of chess. But there were signs of something darker. Chase began riding his bicycle to a rabbit farm, buying rabbits, and consuming them raw. When his father asked about the animals, Chase casually replied that he was eating them. His father didn't press further. By then, he was used to his son's strange remarks. In 1976, things escalated again. Chase was rushed to the emergency room after injecting rabbit blood into his veins. His father found him vomiting and barely able to move. Doctors diagnosed blood poisoning. Chase explained it away with a bizarre story, that the rabbit had swallowed battery acid. He was committed once more, this time to the American River Hospital's psychiatric facility. He refused group therapy, complained that his body was falling apart, and was eventually transferred to Beverly Manor Psychiatric Hospital. There, his obsession with blood became impossible to ignore. Staff nicknamed him Dracula. He snapped the necks of birds that flew near the ward windows and drank their blood. He even extracted blood from therapy dogs using stolen syringes. Despite all of this, after treatment with psychotropic drugs, doctors deemed him no longer a danger to society. In 1976, he was released into his mother's custody. Staff strongly disagreed with the decision. One later told reporters, quote, "It was his turn to be released, and anything we had to say or do about it was irrelevant. He was sick and dangerous." Another staff member added, quote, "He needed extensive care. He was not receiving as much care as he should have gotten." Chase's mother quickly weaned him off his medication, saying she disliked how it made him like a zombie. She secured him another apartment. There, his violence escalated further. He moved from rabbits and birds to dogs. He purchased puppies, hanged them, cut them open, and consumed their blood and organs. Neighbours noticed strange things. Dawn Larson recalled him wandering the complex aimlessly, mouth hanging open, unresponsive when greeted. She saw him bring home dogs and even a cat, though pets weren't allowed. She never saw the animals again. At first, Chase allowed his mother to visit, but only at the doorway. Soon, he refused to let anyone inside, speaking to them only through a crack in the door. In 1977, about a year after Richard Chase had been hospitalized, his delusions spilled into public view in a way that should have set off every alarm. He was discovered in a field near Lake Tahoe, Nevada, naked, his body smeared in cow's blood. The image is grotesque, but more than that, it's revealing. By this point, Chase's obsession with blood had moved beyond the privacy of his apartment and into the open. He was no longer just killing animals behind closed doors. He was performing his delusions in public, unable to contain them. The incident was reported, authorities knew about it, and yet nothing was done. No arrest, no psychiatric hold, no follow-up. This moment is chilling because it represents a misintervention point. Chase had already been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. He had already been hospitalized for blood-related delusions. He had already been nicknamed Dracula by staff who watched him drink the blood of birds through the bars of his hospital window. And now, there he was, naked in a field, covered in the blood of a slaughtered cow. But instead of being recommitted or monitored, he was simply allowed to walk away. And within months, Chase escalated again, this time to human victims. In December 1977, Richard Chase managed to purchase a .22 caliber pistol, concealing his history of mental illness on the application. Not long after, neighbours began hearing gunfire from inside his apartment. When questioned, Chase explained that he was shooting at the voices in his head, and the bullet holes in the wall seemed to confirm it. His violence towards animals also escalated. He no longer relied only on knives. Now he shot dogs in the head, claiming it made it easier to collect their blood. He would place cups against the wounds to catch it. Small dogs, including Labrador puppies, became his victims. At one point, he even attempted to steal a large St. Bernard from a nearby residence, though he failed. On December 29, 1977, Chase killed his first known human victim in a drive-by shooting. Ambrose Griffin, a 51-year-old father of two, was helping his wife unload groceries from the car. A small, domestic moment, the kind of moment that should have been safe. As Mrs. Griffin carried bags inside, she heard two sharp cracks. At first, she thought it was a car backfiring, but then Ambrose collapsed beside her. She thought he was having a heart attack. When paramedics arrived, the truth was far worse. Ambrose had been shot. A .22 caliber bullet had struck him in the chest. He died almost instantly. Police were baffled. There was no robbery, no confrontation, no motive. Just a man gunned down in front of his home while unloading groceries. Ambrose's two children later reported seeing their neighbour walking around the neighbourhood with a rifle the same week their father was killed. According to police records, the neighbour's rifle was seized, but later determined it wasn't the same one used in the murder. 2 weeks after the murder of Ambrose Griffin, Richard Chase began prowling neighbourhoods, testing doors. He later told detectives that he believed that a locked door was a sign he wasn't welcome, but if a door was unlocked, he took it as an invitation to come inside. On one occasion, he entered a home while the residents were away. When the couple returned unexpectedly, they found Chase inside, rifling through their belongings. He fled, but not before leaving behind something deeply disturbing. He had urinated and defecated on their infant child's bed and clothing. In another break-in, he targeted an unoccupied house. Once inside, he attempted to set fire to the drapes. Later, he explained to investigators that he believed the family who lived there had been spying on him, and that he had wanted them gone from the neighbourhood. On January 23, 1978, Richard Chase entered the Sacramento home of Teresa Terry Wallen, a 22-year-old woman who was 3 months pregnant. Teresa had stepped outside to take out the trash when Chase confronted her. He fired his .22 caliber handgun, the first shot striking her hand as she tried to shield herself. A second bullet hit her in the cheek, shattering her jaw, and a third struck her in the head, knocking her unconscious. Once inside, Chase dragged her body into the bedroom. There he used a butcher knife taken from her kitchen to mutilate her. He inflicted multiple stab wounds to her abdomen and removed several internal organs, including her spleen, which he cut out entirely. Both kidneys were severed and repositioned beneath her liver. He also cut off one of her nipples, and using an empty yogurt cup from her trash, he drank her blood. Before leaving, he desecrated her body further by forcing dog feces from the yard into her mouth. Although Chase wore rubber gloves during the attack, he made no attempt to conceal the crime scene. He left the butcher knife behind, and investigators later determined that Teresa was still alive during part of the mutilation. Remnants of her unborn child were also found. That evening, Teresa's husband, David Wallen, returned home from his job as a truck driver. The house was dark, the stereo was playing, and their dog greeted him at the door. Following a trail of stains into the bedroom, he caught only a glimpse of his wife's body before screaming and fleeing the house. He called his parents for help, though he had hoped they would be spared from seeing the scene. When police arrived, they were told the victim had been shot and, quote, opened up with a knife. Though it was clear she was dead, officers still performed standard checks for signs of life. Detective Wayne Array later recalled that her eyes were open, her tongue protruding, and that the terrified expression on her face haunted him for years. He described it as one of the most horrific homicides he had ever encountered, not only because of the brutality, but because Teresa had been pregnant, meaning Chase had also taken the life of her unborn child. Sacramento officer Frank Davidson echoed this sentiment decades later, saying, quote, "I've been to a lot of homicide scenes, taken a lot of pictures, and collected a lot of evidence. But this was the strangest I've ever seen. And many others felt the same. You don't see someone cutting a body open, moving organs around, and treating them like objects." Afterwards, Chase returned to his apartment. He later told a psychiatrist that he spent the rest of the day watching television. In the days that followed, he phoned his mother, rambling about rockets, spaceships, and little green men. On January 27, 1978, Richard Chase entered the Sacramento home of Evelyn Miroth, a 36-year-old divorced mother. What followed was the deadliest and most horrifying act of his spree. Near the front door, Chase encountered Dan Meredith, a 51-year-old family friend who had stopped by that morning. Meredith was battling a brain tumor at the time. Chase shot him twice in the head, killing him instantly. Inside the home, Chase turned his gun on Evelyn, her 6-year-old son Jason, and her 22-month-old nephew David Ferreira. All three were fatally shot in the head. What happened next was an escalation of the same ritualistic violence seen in the murder of Teresa Wallen. Using a kitchen knife, Chase mutilated Evelyn's body. He cut open her abdomen, removed organs, and inflicted repeated stab wounds. He attempted to remove one of her eyes. Evidence later showed that some of the wounds punctured her uterus. Investigators also determined that Chase engaged in necrophilia and cannibalism at the scene. The brutality extended to young David Ferreira. Chase stabbed the toddler and inflicted wounds to his skull in order to access blood. Evidence suggests that the child was shot in his crib before his body was moved. Evelyn's body, too, was dragged into the bedroom where it was later found. A bathtub in the home was discovered filled with blood. Investigators debated whether Evelyn had been bathing when Chase entered, or whether Chase himself had used the tub during or after the killings. When this horror was unfolding, a knock came at the door. 6-year-old Tracy Grangard, a neighbour and friend of Jason's, had arrived for a planned playdate. Chase later told investigators that the sound startled him. Panicked, he grabbed David Ferreria's body and fled. He left behind a chaotic crime scene. 3 knives were used in the attack. 2 were found inside the house, and another was discarded outside in the yard. Chase escaped in Dan Meredith's car, taking the toddler's body with him. Back at his apartment, Chase decapitated the child and consumed part of the brain. When later questioned about this act, he claimed he had been hungry and mistook the remains for something else. When 6-year-old Tracy Grangard knocked on the door of the Miroff home that morning, she unknowingly startled Richard Chase and likely prevented further killings. Her family, alarmed when she returned without Jason, alerted a neighbour who quickly called police. What officers found inside was devastating. Dan Meredith lay in a pool of blood near the front door. Detective Ray Biondi later described the scream as, quote, a house of carnage. For him, the hardest moment was seeing the body of 6-year-old Jason Miroff, because Biondi himself had a son the same age. Jason was still dressed in the new clothes he had put on for the day trip he was meant to take with Tracy's family. In the bedroom, police discovered the mutilated body of Evelyn Miroff. Her 22-month-old nephew, David Ferreria, was missing from his crib. Investigators admitted they had little hope the child was still alive. The killer had left behind a wealth of evidence. Full handprints and shoe prints in blood. The brutality of the crime scene immediately linked it to the earlier murder of Teresa Wallen. Police abandoned their initial theory that Wallen might have been killed by someone connected to her husband. This was clearly the work of the same disturbed individual. Sacramento FBI agent Russ Vorpagel brought in profiler Robert Russell to assist. Together they built a profile of the killer. A white male in his 20s, suffering from severe mental illness, likely beginning in adolescence and worsening over the past 8 years, disorganized, leaving behind overwhelming evidence, and dirty, disheveled, and unable to take care of himself. Vorpagel later explained, quote, we know darn well that your normal everyday person is not going to fill a tub with water and bathe in the blood. Here we see personality, mental illness, deterioration. Witnesses also reported seeing a long-haired man in an orange ski parka, the same jacket Chase's father had recently bought him, knocking on doors the day before the murders, asking for old newspapers. One of the most important witnesses was Nancy Westfall, now Nancy Holden, a former high school acquaintance of Chase. She recalled being approached by a man in an orange parka while shopping. At first, she didn't recognize him. His appearance had changed drastically. His hair was long, his eyes sunken, his mouth ringed with a yellow crust, and his clothes stained with blood. He asked her a strange question about an old boyfriend of hers who had died in a motorcycle accident years earlier. When he introduced himself as Rick, she realized it was Richard Chase. Unsettled, she locked her car doors and drove away when he asked for a ride. Her account, combined with the FBI profile and neighborhood sightings, gave police the lead they needed. When officers moved in on Chase's apartment, he refused to let them inside, so they staged a ruse, pretending to leave while waiting outside. When Chase finally stepped out, they tackled him. He resisted arrest and was armed at the time. Detective Wayne Array later admitted he considered shooting him, fearing for the missing baby's life, but he held back, saying years later, quote, that's when I found out I'm not like him. Even though it would have been justified, I couldn't kill him. He's a cold-blooded killer, and we aren't. Inside Chase's apartment, police found a nightmare. The walls, floors, ceiling, refrigerator, and even his eating utensils were soaked in blood. Several dog collars were discovered, along with rotting organs belonging to both animals and human victims. He had been reading gun magazines, psychology texts, and a book titled Psychic People. Classified ads for dogs for sale were circled in the newspaper. On his calendar, the dates of the Wallen and Miroff murders were marked with the word today. The same word appeared on 44 other dates throughout 1978. Chase was uncooperative. insisting he had only killed dogs and was being framed by the Italians. He even suggested the murders were committed by a blonde man in an orange jacket. It wasn't until March 78 that police discovered the decomposed remains of baby David Ferreira, hidden in a box inside a garbage bin. In psychiatric interviews, Chase gave only vague answers. When asked what was on his mind, he said normal things and an exploding 747 jetliner. He spoke of lights in the sky that might be UFOs and falsely claimed he was Jewish, saying gangs of Italians had beaten him because of it. In 1979, Richard Chase stood trial on 6 counts of murder. Still deep in delusion, he insisted he wanted a lawyer from the Jewish Defense League, claiming he was a persecuted Jew. The motion was denied. Instead, his attorney was Faraz Salami, a Sacramento local and the son of Lebanese migrants. While awaiting trial, Chase complained constantly that his jail food was poisoned. He even ordered his lawyer to have it tested. The results came back negative. The defense strategy was clear: avoid the death penalty. They argued for second-degree murder, hoping for a life sentence. Their case leaned heavily on Chase's long history of mental illness, suggesting his crimes were not premeditated. Salami later reflected that Chase was, quote, the most deranged person I'd ever met, a case of pure mental disease. Psychiatric interviews during the trial revealed Chase's fractured thinking. He admitted guilt in a detached way, saying, quote, I didn't kill anybody, just a few people. He remembered little of the Muroff murders. About Teresa Wallen, he told doctors, quote, I was sick, poisoned by iodine or mercury. I walked into somebody's house and killed them. He explained that he needed blood to survive, that animal blood hadn't helped, and that his weakness prevented him from living like a human being. He pled not guilty by reason of temporary insanity, even requesting to be examined by a heart specialist for a supposed stolen pulmonary artery. He told the jury he was a good person, but with a weak heart and mind. He also confessed he feared his victims might return from the dead. During the trial, Teresa Wallen's husband gave a victim impact statement. In one surreal moment, Chase's mother confronted him in court, criticizing their German shepherd for not protecting the family on the day of the murder. Wallen's husband, stunned, replied that she should have protected them from her son. On May 8, 1979, the jury found Chase guilty of 6 counts of first-degree murder. They rejected the insanity plea and sentenced him to die in the gas chamber. Prosecutor Ronald W. Tocherman convinced jurors that while Chase was mentally disturbed, he still knew right from wrong. The fact that he wore gloves during the murders was key evidence of premeditation. At San Quentin, Chase's reputation preceded him. Other inmates, horrified by his crimes, avoided him. Some even tried to persuade him to take his own life. Prison officials described him as psychotic from the moment he arrived. By December 1979, psychiatrists had him transferred temporarily to Vacaville, a facility for the criminally insane, describing him as chronically psychotic and incompetent. Chase's delusions continued. He wrote documents blaming the murders on UFOs, the CIA, the mafia, even airline disasters. He claimed he was the product of a UFO cloning experiment, that his mother had poisoned him since infancy, and that he was born with the Star of David on his forehead. He asked to be moved to an East Coast prison, believing he'd be safer from UFOs there. In 1979, FBI profiler Robert Ressler interviewed Chase at San Quentin. Ressler wanted to validate the profile he'd built during the investigation. He described Chase as gaunt with eyes like, quote, black dots, like a shark. Chase spoke of Nazis, UFOs, and poison. He told Ressler he was suffering from soap dish poisoning. He explained, quote, if you lift the soap and the dish underneath is dry, you're fine. If it's gooey, you've been poisoned. He claimed the poison had turned his blood into powder, and that killing was his way of replenishing it. He asked Ressler for a radar gun to capture Nazi UFOs so they could stand trial for the murders. At one point, Chase pulled macaroni and cheese from his pants pockets, food he'd been hoarding because he believed prison staff were trying to poison him. He begged Ressler to have it tested at the FBI lab. Ressler played along, later explaining that with psychotic offenders, you don't challenge the fantasy. You let them keep talking. On the morning of December 26, 1980, guards found Richard Chase dead in his cell at San Quentin. He had overdosed on Sinequin, an antidepressant prescribed for depression and hallucinations. He had been secretly hoarding the pills, taking 36 times the normal dose. He was found lying face down on his bunk, his head buried in the mattress, legs extended off the bed. Nearby were 4 handwritten pages, 2 filled with coded squares, 2 with a message suggesting he might take pills that would stop his heart. The official ruling was suicide, but some, including Ressler, believed it might have been accidental, that Chase had taken the overdose in an attempt to silence the voices in his head. Richard Chase's story is one of horror, but it's also one of failure. Failures of intervention, of recognition, and of systems that should have protected the vulnerable. 6 people lost their lives of this. Ambrose Griffin, a husband and a father, gunned down while helping his wife with groceries. Teresa Wallen, just 22 years old, 3 months pregnant, her life and her child's life stolen in a single afternoon. Evelyn Maroff, a mother doing her best to raise her family. Jason Maroff, only 6 years old, dressed in new clothes for a day trip he never got to take. Dan Meredith, a family friend who stopped by to help and never walked out again. David Ferreira, just 22 months old, whose short life ended in unimaginable violence. These names matter, their lives mattered. Chase's crimes were grotesque, but the deeper tragedy is how many warning signs were missed. His delusions were visible. His violence towards animals was known. He was hospitalized, diagnosed, and released, again and again. Each time, the chance to intervene slipped away. For Sacramento, the winter of 1978 was a season of fear, but for the families of the victims, the grief never ended. When we tell stories like this, it's not to sensationalize the violence. It's to remember the people whose lives were lost, and to confront the ways our systems fail when mental illness, violence, and neglect collide. Richard Chase became known as the Vampire of Sacramento, but that label risks obscuring the truth. He was a man whose untreated illness and unchecked violence destroyed families, and whose victims deserve to be remembered not for how they died, but for how they lived. Thank you for listening.